Thank you for joining our webinar. Today we have Pagita with us. Pagita, it's always a pleasure to have you here with us. And before we start, I'd like to
Pleasure.
let you guys know about the house rules of our webinar. First of all, I'd like to ask you guys to not click share screen in any circumstances. And then to reduce network usage and prevent unnecessary interruption, please leave your video and microphone off until you're given the chance to ask a question. And the third guideline is to ask a question during the Q&A segment. You can select participants, raised hand, and priorities will be given to SGPP students. And for you guys who are attending this webinar as an attendee, you can write your question down in the Q&A section. Okay, so feel free to submit your questions through Q&A, chat, or for those of you who are watching us on YouTube, you can write your questions down in the comment section. And please don't forget to state your institution and name and write the question that is relevant to the topic that is being talked about today. So today, Pagita will be talking about digital technology in the current global context. As you guys might have heard already, we also did a webinar this morning inviting Charles Guino. He is the CEO of Online Pajak, and he talked about the implementation, or rather the a pragmatic view about digital technology in the current global context. While as Pagita will be giving a lecture on a more general point of view. So without further ado, Pagita, I invite you to start the lecture.
Thanks, Fendry. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the lecture this afternoon. And I just want to basically repeat a couple of things that I used to say in the past. Frequently, I got asked by students or people around as to what I would regard as the main course in my life. And, I've always made the distinction between desserts and main course. And the main course in my life really would have been, at least as of recent times, would have been with respect to, how we could actually live in a much more environmentally friendly manner. That would basically be relevant to how we're preserving the planet, how we can actually comply with climate change rules and regulations going forward. And the second main course item is really with respect to how we can actually usher more equality in this world, given the fact that in recent years we've seen a rise of inequality in so many places around the world. And I think it's not only sad, but it's a bit of a mockery that at a time when we have an abundance of capital floating around the planet, that money or capital is not being channeled to the right places so that we could actually do much more than we could have done in the past in terms of bringing down inequality. And I think with respect to these two items, i.e., the preservation of the climate and the planet, and also the ability for us to actually reduce inequality, can be helped in a great deal by the presence, if not the ubiquity, of digital capabilities that we've seen rise in the past at least 10 to 20 years. I think the birth of this, transformation or evolution in the digital sense really would have been spurred in the mid 60s when a guy by the name of uh, Gordon Moore, who was basically a computer scientist, engineer, who predicted that the capacity of a microchip would double, not only in terms of size, but also in terms of its speed every couple of years. And amazingly, his prediction has been with the utmost accuracy, even to this point, even to the point where we could also predict that that prediction is going to carry on for many more years to come. And that has been reflected in the ease with which we've been able to use equipment. So, and speaking of equipment, I think, as much as internet would have started long time ago, but it wasn't really starting to get popularized, until maybe the late 80s or early 90s, when more and more people on planet Earth would have been using computers to basically communicate and telecommunicate with each other around the globe. But then it was just much more significantly, popularized by way of the birth of the smartphones. And I think one of the biggest inflection points in terms of the smartphone's capability of popularizing the internet for people's day-to-day use would have been the birth of the iPhone in 2007. That, I think, has taken the inflection from the from the preceding paradigm to the new paradigm in such a big way, where now, out of the 7.4, 7.5 billion people on the planet, more than 5 billion people have basically handphones, and most of those are actually smartphones, which would allow people to actually use the internet. Now, in terms of the access to the internet, we're looking at a slightly over 4 billion people on the planet in terms of their ability to use the internet through the mobile phones. And I think it's pretty conclusive that, going forward, people are going to be accessing the internet more from their mobile phones as opposed to their laptops or even desktop computers. I think, we can assume that most people that are actually working in offices that are using the desktop computers, they would actually rather access the internet via their handphones or mobile sets as opposed to their desktops or laptops, while they're actually doing the administrative functions on the computers. It is easy, I think, to conclude that the access to the internet through the mobile capabilities is only going to rise going forward. But it speaks of, on one account, good things, but on the other account, I think it speaks of potentially not so good things. Not so good things in the sense that people are spending more and more time on their mobile phones as opposed to other things, which I think are slightly, if not highly of, significantly of higher quality. If we take a look at the statistics in terms of the number of hours that the average American, average Indonesian, average Asian would be spending on their mobile phones, it's pretty staggering. Okay, the average Americans are actually spending about 4.5 hours a day on their mobile phones, whereas the Asian people, including the Indonesian people, are actually spending more than 5 hours per day on their mobile phones. So you begin to think as to whether or not they're actually getting quality information, and you begin to think as to whether or not they're actually spending quality time on their mobile phones. We can have a debate about this. We can have a Q&A about this later. But I think we're going through a very interesting phase in our lives where we are being basically confronted with the luxury of having an equipment that can allow us to access so much information, while at the same time you're actually not being more informed. You're actually being somewhat misinformed or more misinformed, if not uninformed, depending on how you look at it. So these are, I think, some of the traits that we're going through in terms of how digital technology has basically influenced humanity and how we can actually expect how digital technology is going to be able to shape the world over. If we can go through the slides. Next. We can go through, we can go to the page on disruption versus dislocation. Carry on. Yeah, no, move back. Okay. Oh, too fast. One more. Okay. Look, I think a lot of people, have been asking me questions as to what the difference is between a disruption and a dislocation. I think a disruption could be characterized in ways where you actually have a new business model in a digital sense that basically makes a pre-existing business model almost obsolete, if not completely obsolete. And we can use the example of the ride-sharing model, which was precipitated in the US. It was called Uber. It made, ride sharing the thing in a very quick amount of time. And it basically collapsed, almost collapsed totally the pre-existing model of hailing a taxi to go from one place to another. And they basically try to take that to the point of, trying to provide additional services for not only people to ride from one place to another, but also for goods and services to move from one place to another, and even to try to take it to the next level of actually permitting or allowing people to actually borrow, from each other, or to each other, or lend to each other, as at the expense of the pre-existing model, which would have been around for decades. When stuff like that happens, it really is a disrupting, phenomenon. But if you want to ask as to what could be a dislocation, I think a dislocation could be described or illustrated in the context of how a particular disruption or a technological disruption or a set of technological disruptions would actually make people feel uneasy about life, about livelihood, about how they're actually going to live in the future. A case in point would be that again, using the example of ride sharing technology, I think people would begin to wonder as to how ride sharing is going to go forward in the context of automation. We've been hearing a lot about autonomous driving that's been basically pioneered by many people in Silicon Valley, many people in China. I think it is conceivable to basically predict a future in the not so distant future, where we're actually going to be seeing a significant degree of autonomous driving. Now, to the extent that autonomous driving is going to be applied to ride sharing capabilities, then you start wondering, if not being concerned, as to how we're actually going to deal with the hundreds of thousands of drivers that would be replaced by the autonomous driving capabilities, or by the robots that are actually going to be running the vehicles or the transportation modes. That replacement in such a significant manner would actually create some sort of a political, social, cultural instability, to the extent that you feel so concerned about what's happening. And that, I think, would somewhat characterize a dislocation by way of the series of technological disruptions that are taking place. And I think we are in that phase where we would have gone through a set of disruptions, in the last few years that would have game changed the game, that would have basically made pre-existing business models obsolete to some extent, if not to a full extent. And I think we're about to go through a phase where we're going to be just completely uncomfortable with everything that's happening from a technological standpoint, where, societally, we are getting dislocated. And I think that is something to anticipate in the near foreseeable future. Now, in terms of what it has and how it has affected humanity, I think I would like to basically point out one good thing about what digital transformation could do for our ability to have access to capital. Countries like Indonesia have been, somewhat concerned about our relative inability to increase the financial inclusiveness of our people, and that is basically the access to capital. We've been hearing lots of, quotations or numbers or figures in terms of how financially inclusive we are. We've been sort of like hovering around the 35 to 40% in terms of the percentage of those people that are older than 15 years old that have a bank account. Now, I think with the sheer ability of a mobile phone to allow someone from one end to basically put in, digitally, a balance of money that could actually be lent to someone else on the other side of the globe or on the other side of the country, who has that similar mobile capability to actually borrow. That is, I think, going to game change, the financial inclusiveness of the country from, the 40% figure to hopefully a much higher figure. Hopefully we can take that to, around the 90 to 95% figure that, we're seeing in countries like Singapore. Singapore has a financial inclusion of 98%. And that, I think, reflects upon not only the modernity of the country, but it also reflects upon, the types of infrastructure that they've actually built so that people could have access to money or capital. And that, I think, would be one of the, potential benefits of, digitization that's been happening, in a big way in Indonesia for the last few years. We're hopeful that, peer-to-peer lending could take a big leap in the coming years. We have not seen too big of a leap yet in terms of the increase in financial inclusion, but we're hopeful that that number is going to go up in the near foreseeable future. Now, the third point I want to bring up is basically with respect to social equity that could be brought about by way of the digital transformation or digital presence that we're seeing in many places around the world. As much as we would have believed that, digitization would have brought about, better access to information for everyone, it doesn't appear that it has actually brought about equity in terms of the access to information for everyone. We would have heard many stories around how, the likes of Google and Facebook would have actually been extracting more information as opposed to, providing useful information for society or humanity, merely for the benefit of themselves, the benefit of those two companies in terms of enriching themselves institutionally, and also in terms of enriching, the shareholders and the stakeholders of those two companies, surely at the expense of, the extracting of data from the population, without really entailing, financial or economic or even social benefit to the people whose data points have actually been scraped or extracted by many of these digital companies, including those two names that I've already mentioned. So We are seeing a phase today where, as much as we would have believed this was going to bring about more social equity, this has actually brought about more social inequality, and as a result of which, or as a byproduct of which, we have seen even a higher income gap, a higher wealth gap, and also the inability of policy making bodies to actually adapt to the new paradigm, so that there's actually more equal, distribution of wealth, of economic benefits for everyone. This has been a criticism towards the likes of Facebook, where not only did they participate in seemingly co-opting democracy, in the context of the United States elections in 2016, by way of basically extracting data from the electorate for the purpose of opposition research, and also the purpose of actually opposition, to basically not only oppose but also to crush their opposing sides, and while at the same time they were actually getting accruals of economic benefits because of the extraction of data that was sold from one place to another. This is not good news for us and for the world. And as much as we would have expected policymakers, legislators, and also the civil society to be critical of such behavior, and even would enforce upon whatever legislation, whatever rules and regulations that would be necessary to reshape the behavior, we have not seen that, to the scale that we would have hoped. As a result of all this, I'm basically seeing a further, diminution of equity in the social context, in the economic context, and also in the cultural context. Next. These are numbers that may be a little bit out of date, but out of the 7.6 billion population, a good chunk of that already has access to mobile phones, but not all the mobile phones are actually smartphones with internet capabilities. As such, about 4.3 billion people out of the 7.6 billion people on planet Earth have access to the internet, and most of that number is actually relevant to the use of mobile technologies as opposed to computer technologies, and a good chunk of those that would have had access to the internet are actually using or have access to the social media platforms such as Instagram or Facebook, or any other social media platforms. Next. This is a geographic representation of the internet penetration. Vividly, we can see that there is a much higher internet penetration in the Northern American part of the world, and also the Western European parts of the world, and also some parts in East Asia, particularly South Korea and Japan, where we've seen very, very high levels of internet penetration. And China is also showing increasing amount of internet penetration by way of their mobile technology. Next. Next. This is again a picture of how the internet has allowed people to basically use the social media platform, inclusive of the WhatsApp capability. Around 2 billion people have already access to WhatsApp, telecommunication capabilities, and YouTube, Netflix, and particularly during this COVID-19, I think it's more apt now that people are actually embracing technological platforms for telecommunicating with each other more than ever, and also for their own pleasure or leisure at home, in basically consuming contents through the Netflix platform. I think you know, these platforms that we're seeing, including Instagram, Netflix, YouTube, and WhatsApp, are likely to go up, you know, in usage in the next few months at the rate that, you know, we're likely to continue seeing physical distancing, you know, policy implementation in many parts of the world, and at the rate that, you know, we are basically not able to physically move from one place to another. You know, telecommunication platforms through the digital platforms for people to basically consume contents and to also telecommunicate will continue to be rising in terms of usage and also need. Next. I've talked about this in terms of how people in the United States are actually spending more and more time on their mobile, you know, devices, and less so on the televisions. If we, you know, look around, you know, the millennial generation and even the younger than millennial generation, they're not watching TVs like, you know, the older generation like me or I would, you know, until today. Even I could argue that I'm actually watching, as much as I'm still watching TV, but I'm watching TV less than, you know, what I would have been watching in the past 5 or 10 years, or 5 or 10 years ago. And that, I think, is a reflection of not only how culturally we have shifted, but also technologically we have shifted in terms of our ability to actually have, you know, upon demand content viewing through the handphones, as opposed to, you know, waiting for the next series of Friends or the next episode of, you know, whatever, you know, your favorite movie is on TV. That paradigm, I think, has shifted to a new paradigm where, you know, you can access just about anything on a mobile phone. The byproduct of this is that, you know, I've said this in the past, you know, if you would have talked to the Surgeon General of any country within the developed community, the most popular diseases in the past would have been, you know, heart or cancer. But now I think at the rate that we're spending a lot more time on mobile phones, you could argue that, you know, the increasingly popular disease would be isolation. And that would be because of our, you know, spending a lot more time on mobile phones as opposed to other, you know, more useful things that we could have been doing in life. Next. This is basically an illustration of artificial intelligence faces. We saw in the 90s in terms of how artificial intelligence was, you know, getting into play by way of the internet penetration, increasing at a much higher level than before. As I said earlier, you know, we were accessing the internet, you know, on a massive basis. We're just starting to access the internet probably around the late 80s and early 90s. And as it developed in terms of the speed of the microchip and the size of the microchip that's being installed in the computers at that time, people were actually accessing the internet a lot more in the late 90s than they would have had, you know, in the early 90s. And this kind of like developed into the next phase of artificial intelligence, which is really the business, you know, artificial intelligence phase, which basically started off in the early 2000s. And then it evolved into the next phase of artificial intelligence, which we call the perception artificial intelligence in 2011. And as of late, we've been hearing a lot about, you know, artificial intelligence in the context of, you know, autonomous applications, be it for autonomous driving or any kinds of robotics that would basically be supported by artificial intelligence. And this has been occurring in a big way ever since 2015 in terms of how a number of countries are actually pumping a lot of money and a lot more money than before on artificial intelligence capabilities in the autonomous side of the game. The United States and China are racing in terms of how much they're pumping money into each one of these four phases of artificial intelligence: internet, business, perception, and autonomous artificial intelligence. At the moment, you could argue that the United States may have an edge over China, but I would also argue that I think in no time, if not in a near foreseeable future, China is going to be not only matching the United States. I think they have a real good chance of actually surpassing the United States in any of these four phases of artificial intelligence applications. Next phase, next page. This is a graphic of where today United States and China are in each one of those four phases of artificial intelligence. And on the right side, it's a picture of where I think the United States and China are going to fare with each other in the context of each one of those four phases of artificial intelligence. Next. This is basically a picture of how countries are actually spending on research and development. On the right side, you can see South Korea and Israel actually spending on in terms of the percentage of their GDP, the spending on artificial intelligence, the spending on research and development, the spending on STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, vis-a-vis other countries that are less, if not much less. Indonesia, unfortunately, is way out on the left. It's not spending any more than 0.1% of its GDP. Whereas countries like Israel and Korea or South Korea are spending more than 4% of their GDP on research and development. This, I think, would change going forward, and I'm quite optimistic in terms of how the government of Indonesia is actually allocating a lot more on education now than ever. Going back to 2019, I think the Indonesian government spent more than 400 trillion rupees on education. That is roughly around 20% of the government budget. And at the rate that the Indonesian government is mandated to spend 20% of its budget on education, the forward view in terms of how much the Indonesian government is going to be spending on education is actually pretty staggering. I'll have a slide later, but approximately, if you take a 25-year view until 2045, the Indonesian government is going to be spending between $3 to $5 trillion on education. And as a result of that, you are going to see a huge spike in terms of the percentage of research and in terms of the percentage of spending on research and development vis-a-vis its Indonesia's GDP. The 0.1% is going to change dramatically to a much larger number, and with that, we hope that we can actually compete technologically with some of our neighboring countries in Southeast Asia, if not beyond. On the right-hand side is a depiction of how much actually venture capital is spending, on research and development. And clearly, we're seeing, countries like Israel and Singapore outspending, the rest in terms of their, venture capital spending for digital technologies, and we've seen many of the startups that are actually coming out of Israel, more so than in Singapore, being able to actually reshape how we are moving forward digitally. Next page. There's a lot of stuff that basically policy making revolves around, and I've been making comments in the past in terms of how we are actually not accruing or not enough economic benefit is accruing to everyone by way of their ability to use, digital technology. In addition to the fact that, the privacy issue of an individual in the context of his or her using, a mobile technology is not being addressed to the fullest extent. From a policymaking standpoint, I see the Europeans, I think, are much more advanced in basically reacting, but also staying on top of the privacy issue. You would have heard, the term GDPR, which stands for, General Data Protection Rights, and I think the GDPR in most Western European countries that has been set as to basically protect the privacy of an individual in using his or her technological device is not only much more advanced, but it's I think something to be used as an example for countries like Indonesia, and particularly to be used as an example by the United States, which I think is way behind the Europeans in terms of protecting the privacy of the data. We saw this incident where there was a terrorist incident in San Bernardino, where the supposed terrorist was using this iPhone, and there was a debate between the government of the United States and Apple in terms of whether or not the government could actually hack into the computer or the iPhone, so that they could actually trace how the terror could have started preceding the event in San Bernardino. Apple had actually insisted that the privacy of the individual was to be respected and revered, while the government basically took a different view, in that this was for the benefit of national interest, in that they should be able to actually crack and open the codes within that device. Anyway, that's sort of a divide between the government and Apple. I think will continue as a debate going forward until we are likely to see a more stringent policy posture in protecting the privacy of the data of the individual using the mobile or digital technology. Whereas, in Europe, it would have been very clear in terms of how the protection of the individual's data in his or her, particular digital equipment would be handled. And I think Indonesia needs to use the European example for the purpose of protecting the privacy of the data of an individual. While we are now seeing actually an abundance of examples where the data of a particular individual is actually being extracted by the large digital companies for the benefit of those companies only, as opposed to for the benefit of that individual. So I think data protection, security, and privacy are key items that I think policymakers in countries like Indonesia need to be paying attention to. As much as we want to see this happen going forward, I'm still not sure as to whether or not this is going to take place anytime soon. At the rate that the influence of the large digital corporations upon policymaking bodies is so significant that I think it's going to be very, very hard for us to expect a more prudent, if not stringent, policy posture in protecting one's privacy rights and data protection rights. Next. This is basically a picture of the readiness of the different countries in ASEAN. I think it's clear Indonesia is not too far behind compared to other Southeast Asian countries, but I think the key is how not only Indonesia, but the whole of ASEAN could actually, move up the ladder in terms of bringing about more financial inclusion, so that we could actually see uh, a lowering of inequality, social inequality, financial inequality, economic inequality, so that we could have a much more sustained future, number one. And number two, how we could actually collectively and individually uh, take advantage of digital advancements for the purpose of protecting our climate, as I've said earlier. And these two issues, I think, are issues that I think countries like Indonesia and countries in the whole of Southeast Asia need to be embracing. Next. Next. A picture of, our population and the number of, handphones that's been bought by Indonesians, that's being used by Indonesians, and the number of, users of handphones and computers that have access to internet. It's a pretty staggering figure, in that, we have 150 million people in Indonesia that already have access to internet. I think it's pretty amazing if it could be pretty amazing if that number of 150 million could actually be using digital capabilities for purposes of bettering our lives altogether, not only in terms of the quality of life, but also the quality of our productivity, production, and just about everything that revolves around our life on a daily basis. Unfortunately, we are still seeing a more polarized society, people moving way to the right and people moving way to the left. And we're still seeing financial inclusion at a rate of 40%, as opposed to what we're seeing in Singapore at 98%. But I'm quite optimistic that if together we basically set this in motion and set this as a goal, in terms of increasing financial inclusion and being more aware of the environment. With 150 million people in the country having access to the internet, I think it's going to be pretty good, in terms of our future. Next. 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 This is sort of like the narrative going forward, taking a 25-year view from an educational standpoint. If we were to be spending 20% of our government budget on education, if we were to assume that our tax ratio is at 12%, and if we were to assume that we're spending 20% on education, we're likely to see a cumulative spending of $3 to $5 trillion for educational purposes. As a result of which, if we focus on the right stuff, we might see a much more balanced society where we have less inequality, so that we have a Gini ratio of around 30%, hopefully maximum 30%. We could have financial inclusion of 95% in the next 25 years. By way of applying digital technology, to the objective of increasing financial inclusion, and we could actually have a much more deep number of doctors on a per thousand population basis. At the moment, we have less than 2 doctors per 1,000. If we could increase that to 4 doctors, given what we're going through right now with COVID-19. Not enough doctors attending to patients, not enough equipment, including ventilators, masks, and testing devices, for the people in times of epidemic or a pandemic. We could move towards, some sort of a singularity, and singularity is really the notion of, the amalgamation of machination or computerization with humanity, and that I think would basically take us to a different level, where, you know, the application of autonomous artificial intelligence is in a much more, you know, pervasive manner. And we would be a thriving third, you know, largest democracy in the world after India, with its biggest population, you know, biggest democratic population, and the United States being the second biggest democracy. Uh, and ASEAN would serve as an anchor of regional peace and stability. I have said, you know, many times over that I think one of the biggest distinguishing factors for ASEAN vis-a-vis other unions, inclusive of the European Union, would be that, you know, ASEAN, you know, is very, very uh, defined and pronounced in embracing the three pillars of socio-political affairs, economic affairs, and 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 social, you know, political affairs, uh, and that I think will serve as, you know, peace and stability anchor, not only for ASEAN but for the broader Asia Pacific region. And the other attributes, by way of our spending, you know, $3 to $5 trillion in the next 25 years, I think would be, you know, reflected upon our ability to uh, voice ourselves as a middle power for diplomatic purposes in the region and also around the world. And I think we could be seeing a pretty awesome future if we get this right. Now, the second item in terms of what we're going to be spending quite significantly on is infrastructure. And infrastructure, we've seen the Indonesian government has been spending a lot of money on. You know, we spent more than 400 trillion rupees on infrastructure last year. And at this rate, you know, if we could spend 5% of the government budget on a continuing basis, year on year until 2045, we're likely to be spending between 1.3 to 1.5 trillion dollars on a cumulative basis, and that will translate into much greater connectivity for Indonesia in terms of our being able to build, you know, up to 2 million kilometers of roads. As opposed to only a few 100,000 kilometers of roads today, we would be able to basically ramp up our power generation capabilities to about 1 million megawatts, as opposed to the, you know, the now level of around 60 to 70,000 megawatts. And we could have, you know, by way of the connectivity around the country, we could have, you know, the capacity to attract about 150 million, you know, international tourists on a yearly basis, assuming, of course, no disruptions in health and assuming no disruptions in connectivity. So, in sum, I think, you know, as much as we have seen a dramatic evolution of the internet ever since the discovery of Moore's law in 1965, by way of the doubling of the memory chip and the doubling of the speed, we are still not there yet in terms of getting it right in bringing about financial inclusion and social equity and environmental friendliness. I think there's still a lot of work that could be done in terms of using our digital capabilities for the benefit of planet Earth and for the benefit of, you know, the overall society. Can we actually get there? Yes, we can. As much as, you know, we are seeing a much more polarized world right now in terms of politics, in terms of economics, in terms of society. But I do see this, as I said last week, this COVID-19 as a real chance of equalizing humanity in terms of bringing about people from various backgrounds to an equal and level footing, so that we could actually, you know, shape or reshape the future in a much better way with digital capabilities. Let me just spend you know, a couple of minutes on you know, how technological companies are faring by way of the COVID-19 nowadays. I think by way of the collapse of aggregate demand, it's safe to assume that any digital or technological player that is affected by the drop of aggregate demand would be not doing greatly. But there are some players in the digital space that are, I think, benefiting by way of our inability to move physically from one point to another. The need for Zoom capabilities, the need for Netflix, the need for WhatsApp, calling or video calling and what are going up. But for the most part, I think, technological companies that are involved in ride sharing, food delivery, and, transacting between one place and another, between one person and another, lending, borrowing, and all that have, quite significantly been affected by the COVID-19. And this next few weeks, I think, would be critical in that, hopefully the government and the people of Indonesia would be able to ascertain the denominator so that we could actually figure out when we're going to be able to actually turn the corner and see a much better application of digital technology to our day-to-day life. Let me pause and take any questions.
Okay, so for those of you who have questions, please raise your hand. We actually have one question back from YouTube, our YouTube stream. So the question is about your perspective on the future of economic contribution of agricultural sector, which is currently at 13% of our GDP. What is going to be the future of agriculture in relation to the implementation of technology in this sector? Because it may empower more people in the rural area and it might also reduce inequality.
Well, I think there's two sides of the coin here. We know that there's about 40 million farmers in Indonesia. If we were to actually apply digital technology to agriculture, there is a risk or there is a possibility that some of those 40 million farmers might lose their jobs by way of automation because of the application of digital technologies. While at the same time, we could also expect and hope for the increase of productivity. And I think the reason why the agricultural sector is only contributing, in the teens of percentage to the overall economy, it has something to do with, I think, not only the lack of productivity, but the lack of production, right? What I mean by that is, if we take, rice, for example, okay, the productivity on a per hectare basis in many places in Java, which is supposed to be more fertile than any other areas in Indonesia, we're probably looking at about 7 to 8 tons per hectare. Whereas if we go to neighboring countries such as Thailand or Vietnam, we may be seeing productivity at about 13 to 14 tons per hectare in rice productivity. So right there, we're at 50% of their productivity. Now, to the extent that we can ramp up our productivity from 7 or 8 tons per hectare to 13 or 14 tons per hectare, if not more, then that number of 13 to 15% contribution to the GDP is only going to go up by 2 times, right? Now, in terms of production, not only is it going to go up by way of the increased productivity, but I think we have to be mindful of thinking about increasing agricultural acreage. We are seeing some staples of agriculture which have actually gone down because of the decrease of acreage or land. Thanks to real estate development, thanks to other purposes of the land, all these different uses of the land have basically resulted in the reduction of agricultural acreage. So I think the application of digital technology to agriculture has been seen as being tremendously positive in places like Thailand, Vietnam, Israel. Even now in the Middle East, we're seeing transformation of, deserts into green areas. So will I see the number going up from 13% to, 30%, if not more? Yes. And I think it depends on not only the application of digital technology, but I think it depends on the policy making side of the game also, as to ensure that while we, make sure that, digital technology application is good, but we also have to figure out what's going to happen to those that are going to be displaced by way of automation or digitization.
Thank you, Pak. That was from Hari Prasetyo, by the way, Pak, from YouTube. Okay. And we have another question from Jeffy. Jeffy is one of our students at SGPP. Go ahead, Mas Jeff.
Okay. Hello, Pak Gita, and thank you very much, Pak Safendri, for the opportunity. And it was a great presentation and mesmerizing insight from you, Pak Gita. So I would simply ask you about, this is so interesting to know 5 years from now, China will lead for the artificial intelligence. So as we know, right now, Indonesian governments spend a lot of their expenditure from their GDP for education and infrastructure. So, right. In your mind, do you think that the government of Indonesia will increase their spending of expenditure for AI in the next 5 years? I just want to know in your perspective, Pak Gita. Okay, thank you.
I think, simply put, it's going to go up, but I honestly don't know how much it's going to go up in terms of our spending on artificial intelligence. And, there's two ways to acquire knowledge or know-how on anything, including artificial intelligence. You actually develop it organically, yourself in Indonesia, or you actually buy the technology, right? I tend to think that perhaps the second alternative could be a better alternative, because it allows us to actually quantum leap, and this could be by way of an acquisition of a company anywhere around the world that already has a pre-existing artificial intelligence capability, and that, I think, will allow Indonesia to quantum leap. Now, whether that's going to be done by the government or the private sector in Indonesia, for that to be done by the government, I think it requires open-mindedness within the government, within the policy-making bodies, as to whether or not they would be willing and ready to basically make an acquisition of an artificial intelligence, capability outside Indonesia. But I do think the private sector, I think, stands a better chance, because they're not only open-minded, but they're governed less by rules and regulations in terms of what they can buy or in terms of what they cannot buy. So if the question is with respect to what could happen in the next 5 years, yes, it's going to go up in terms of our artificial intelligence capability. Number two, I think we may have a chance of basically going up by a significant amount if and when either the government and or the private sector could or would undertake an acquisition of artificial intelligence capabilities from beyond. And there's so many places right now where there are companies that are so advanced in artificial intelligence capabilities, inclusive of China and Silicon Valley and Israel, and also even in Singapore, There are companies that, could use capital infusion, and that could be an opportunity for us to basically ramp up on our artificial intelligence capabilities.
Thanks, Pak. Mas Jeff, I hope that answered your question. Okay, so we
Yes.
have. Okay, thanks. So we have
Thank you.
another question from our question and answer session from some of our attendees. The first one is from Raka Suraka. Selamat sore Pak Gita. My name is Faiz from Garut. Okay, Faiz from Garut, West Java. With regards to human microchip trend in Europe, particularly Sweden, thousands have had microchips inserted into their hands. The chip has made their lives more convenient for accessing their homes, offices, gyms, and even making payment. What do you think about this trend, and how far will it transform our lives?
It kind of scares me, to have a chip installed in myself or in anyone's body. As much as you want that to actually help you to become more productive, to become smarter, to become more efficient, whatever, right? But I think we have to be mindful of a number of risks. Okay, one of which is basically hacking. Okay, anytime you have a chip, anytime you have digital capability anywhere, whether it's a server in your office, whether it's a cloud outside your handphone, or it's the memory chip in your handphone, much less a memory chip in your body, that will permit for anyone outside the building, outside the handphone, outside your body to actually communicate, digitally speaking here. And that digital communication capability sometimes has been used for the wrong purposes. And we call that hacking. Okay, anybody could hack into a cloud, anybody could hack into your server, anybody could hack into any chip that you may have anywhere. So as long as we're sure that stuff like that is not going to happen, or as long as we're sure that the probability of that happening is really, really tiny, I'm okay with inserting a chip into my own body. But with what I've been reading and what I've been hearing is that there is no bulletproof guarantee that hacking of anything could be totally prevented. So that would be my mixed answer to the question. I'm sure the people in Sweden are pretty happy with microchips being inserted into their bodies so that they could be hopefully smarter and more productive in doing whatever they want to do. I think there's still other ways to basically get smarter and to actually get more productive without exposing yourself to unnecessary risks of cyber attacks.
Thank you, Pak Gita. Yeah. So Faiz, I hope that answered your question. We have a lot of questions now, Pak. The next one is from Maman Saputra in the question and answer section. He said that most of the traders in the traditional market are old people and they don't use internet. How do we accommodate them? And I think it'll be hard to change this for older people. Meanwhile, the younger generation, they understand about digital marketing, and most of the internet users for a younger generation maybe don't understand marketing itself, not digital marketing, but marketing itself. So perhaps you can give a view on that.
Look, I'm one of the old people he's referring to. I don't know how to use my handphone half as much as I should be able to. I mean, sometimes, I get my kids to figure out how to maneuver around my handphone. I don't use the computer as much as I use my handphone, and I don't use my handphone much either, because I'd rather just read a book or something. So in reference to the old people that have been doing trading, I think they run the risk of being basically substituted by people who are younger, who are much more capable of using digital technology. And unfortunately, in the trading world right now, with everything, all the information, the data points relevant to the trading activities are basically transferred in a digital manner. Anybody that has a better knowledge of or higher proficiency in using digital technology, I think is going to be having the upper hand vis-a-vis those that don't have the proficiency in using digital technology. So I think those old people are at the risk, by way of the younger generations being able to embrace digital technologies for trading purposes. Now, the second part of the question would be, I forgot, the younger people not knowing what again?
Yeah, the younger people, they know more about digital marketing, but the older people might know more about marketing itself. I don't really.
That is true. That is true.
Okay.
But let's not forget, the old people used to be young, right? Long time ago. So I'm sure there's a lot of young people right now who are very good in marketing. So we just got to make sure that not only are they good in marketing, but they actually combine the marketing wisdom with the digital technological wisdom. So I think the first part of the question, I think it's pretty obvious that they're at risk. The older people are at risk. Whereas the second part of the question, I'm not so sure of the young people who are good in technological capability are actually at risk because they don't know how to market, in the traditional manner. I think they could still, market in the traditional manner while using, digital capabilities.
Okay. Thank you, Pak Gita. Pak Maman, I hope that answered your question. Next, we have a question from our student, Pak Mbak Dian. Go ahead, Mbak Dian.
Yeah, thank you, Pak Gita. I believe that there is a positive aspect on impact from the digitalization or technology information. But in the other side, there is so negative impact from the increasing of the technology, like the increase of cybercrime. That there's so many criminal action used by technology, like trafficking in person online, prostitution online, and fintechs, illegal online, etc. And how we can address that cybercrime. And the second is the increase of unemployment, because some of work will lose or will dismiss because replaced by technology, because the digital economic, like some of work in toll now changed by card, you just services, etc. Many activity or job lose lose from the community. Women become the first victim in this situation. In the second, the third is the increasing of what is the lowest is democracy, because of criminalization when we use freedom expression through the digital equipment, like people criminalized based on Undang-Undang ITE, because we talk something or we discuss something, etc. So this then it will have a impact to the democracy, because we lose some of our freedom expression. How to deal with this? Thank you, Pak.
Okay. Well, good questions. Well, the first is with respect to cyber, right? How do we actually mitigate or eliminate the risks of cyber security? Uh, I don't think there is a magic bullet that basically kills it as of today. Uh, you could reduce the risk, but I don't think you could eliminate the risk. And there's ways to basically mitigate risks of cyber, infiltration or attacks on your handphone or any on any microchip, within yourself or within equipments around you. Uh, I see some positivity in terms of what the government is trying to do in Indonesia. There was a regulation that basically would allow for, if not enforce, the onshoring of data center. I do believe that if properly done, the onshoring of data center capabilities as opposed to offshoring data center capabilities, would actually help mitigate the risks. Because if you basically transact financially in Indonesia, and that the data of your transacting is actually stored in a cloud that's actually beyond the boundaries of Indonesia, or in a data center beyond the boundaries of Indonesia, you don't know what's going to happen or what could happen. As much as the companies that are in charge of managing your data tell you that they're actually complying with the strictest in the strictest manner, the rules and regulations, but you just have no control at all. Now, it doesn't mean that if you onshore it, automatically you're going to have much more control over the data that's basically relevant to your transacting. But I think going forward, we have to be mindful of the fact that the onshoring of data center, I think within logic mitigates the risks of cyber infiltration or attacks, as opposed to allowing your data to continue to sit offshore or overseas. Now it has to be, I think, coupled and accompanied by the governments ensuring that whatever exercises or activities they do in onshoring the data would be of the highest standards. We could talk about whether they do it on a tier 3 or tier 4 basis. Data centers in Indonesia are mostly tier 2 and tier 3, whereas data centers in other parts of the world, including Singapore and China and the US and Europe, many of them are already actually tier 4. And tier 4 basically has an additional layer of protection, so that your data does not get abused or does not get infiltrated in the wrong manner. So I think there's still ways to go in terms of not only mitigating the risks of cyber attack, but also eliminating the risks of cyber attack. But in the long run, I'm in favor of basically onshoring data preservation or data storage capabilities. Additionally, I think we've got to be looking at what the Europeans have done in terms of GDPR. I think the data protection rights of individuals are so highly respected, in Europe. And there's been some comments about why the Europeans are actually more willing to be more strict on the privacy of data for individuals. They've been saying that it's partly because the beneficiary of the digital companies would have been more the Americans in terms of job creation. The presence of Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, and all that good stuff. The beneficiaries of the presence of those companies would have been more in the U.S. as opposed to the Europe in terms of job creation. So that the United States seems to be much more relaxed about enforcing upon those digital companies in America, as opposed to the Europeans upon those very same companies in Europe. So those two, I think, are things that you may want to consider in terms of how we can actually look into mitigating the risk of cybersecurity, or even eliminating the risk of cybersecurity. The second question was with respect to the risk of, losing jobs because of, the ever increasing automation. I think that's a fact of life. I've alluded to that earlier, in the context of agricultural, economics. At the rate that we're going to be embracing more, digital technology, there's a risk that some of those 40 million farmers are going to be displaced because of automation, because of digitization, because of technological improvements. And I think it's not going to apply only to the agricultural sector, but it's going to apply to many other sectors. I think a real possibility would be the automotive industry, where we have, I think, more than 1 million drivers in Indonesia. Those 1 million drivers, I think, are going to be at risk at the rate that we're going to implement autonomous driving. Now, from a policy making standpoint, I think what we've got to look at is how do we actually make sure that those people that are going to be displaced could actually transition into some other, employment or gainful employment, whether we teach them how to code, whether we teach them how to cook, or whether we teach them how to basically work in factories. I think it's a bit tough to expect them to know how to code, but we could expect them, I think, to do somewhat of the blue collar type of work, and that, I think, has to be in the planning of the policymakers in anticipation of future automation of jobs in a big way. The third would be, with respect to, democratizing the digital platforms for purposes of, saying anything. But, as of late, we're seeing episodes where, people are actually being reprimanded or being actually acted upon for saying things, in the digital platform, things that shouldn't be said. I think you have to put that in a bigger context of whether or not we want to continue as a democracy. And we unfortunately or fortunately have embraced democracy as a way of life since 1998. And we seem to be thriving pretty well as a democracy. And I think we seem to be, en route to becoming and staying as the third largest democracy for the next few decades, after India and the United States. And I think we've got to be pretty clear about defining what democracy actually entails. Does it actually entail being able to say anything on any platform, or does it only entail being able to say certain things to some extent only? I think you could mitigate the risks of statements on a digital platform that may not be, of acceptance, by way of, giving the person the right kind of education, so that he or she could actually express, commentaries or criticisms in ways that would actually still be acceptable to the other side or to any audience. And number two, the digital platforms, I think, would have to figure out a way to actually filter to some extent, so that we don't have frivolous, statements being made by frivolous people, from any direction. So those are, I think, the two ways of mitigating the risks of, letting democracy run loose, in a digital manner. I'm not in favor of, basically, seeing democracy in a way where we could say anything about anybody. I think there's got to be some respect. There's got to be respect in how we actually applaud people and how we actually criticize people. But in some occasions, we don't see that. And I think that's got something to do with the temperament of the individual. It's got something to do with how that individual would have been educated at home or educated at school, or perhaps no education at all at home or no education at all at school. So in the absence of such, education that's needed, then I think the digital platforms would have to have some sort of a filter that allows for us to actually, live with each other in a better way.
Thank you, Mbak Dian. I hope that answered your question. And that was also...
This answered my question. Thank you, Pak.
Thank you, Mbak Dian.
Thanks.
So that was actually the same question which someone in the Q&A section asked, Hadohoan Satyalen. I hope that answered your question as well. So for the next question, we have Gading Prasasti. Oh, and by the way, before we continue, could you also state your institution as well, for those of you who ask, so that we know who you are. So, okay. So from Gading Prasasti, Pagita, thanks for this session. Do you think all sectors in Indonesia, government, MPs, private businesses, etc., have done enough to create an environment that is tech-friendly for Indonesia to elevate? Who has done enough and who hasn't? Thank you. That's the question, Pak.
Look, I think the risk that we run with is that the private sector is evolving at a faster rate than the public sector, right? The private enterprise, which has embraced digital technological capability, has been evolving and is likely to continue evolving at a faster rate than the public enterprise, than even the social enterprise, right? And I think the risk that we run with, in addition to that risk, is that if the policy-making body or the public enterprise is not adapting, is not evolving at the kind of rate that the private enterprise is evolving, then it would be difficult to basically come up with the necessary policy framework to make sure that the evolution within the private sector or the private enterprise is actually is going to be for the benefit of humanity or the population, right? So I've stated it, earlier in some occasions where if the regulatory body or the policy-making body would be running at a slower rate in adopting and adapting and evolving, then you run the risk of not only coming up with a regulatory framework that's not relevant to what's needed by the private sector, but you could also run the risk of getting some sort of a regulatory framework that would be opposing to what's needed by the private sector, because perhaps, there's some vested interest by certain sponsors who would be vested in the old paradigm, who actually have a greater ability of communicating with the policymakers who are not adapting, adopting, and evolving at the same kind of rate that the private sector is. Then I think would be counterproductive, right, for the necessary positive evolution of digital capability. We're seeing that already in some countries, right, where all of a sudden the government just comes up with a regulation that basically prohibits, certain things that would have been permissible, in the private sector, which would have been clearly for the benefit of the people, but it got prohibited because of the fact that the policymakers didn't understand, or perhaps that the policymakers, just for the heck of it, no, we're not going to do it. We're just going to stop it. We're just going to prohibit it. So that I think slows down progress. As long as we can agree to the fact that, whatever the private sector has been doing is positive for the people. But if it relates to certain things that would have been too fast developing and not so great for the people, I'm okay with that. So for the benefit of the people, I think there needs to be a very, very good feedback loop among the the government, i.e. regulators, i.e. policy-making bodies, i.e. legislators, and also the private sector, so that they have, a very, very good understanding of what's happening and what's to come. And that, the policy-making body could actually come up with the necessary framework so that digital, transformation, happens in a good way. I can point out, a couple of things that haven't been that great, as much as the government would have been supportive of the private sector. Financial inclusion, it still hasn't gone up. And it is one of the predominant reasons as to why we have a very, very high inequality. A Gini ratio of, 30, high 30s, nearing 40. That speaks of a high inequality because of the lack of access to capital for a lot of people. We only have a financial inclusion of only 40%. And, it's a mockery in that 150 million people have access to, the internet, but only a small percentage of those have access to capital. And that to me is intolerable. So that is something that I think the government and the private sector ought to sit down and figure out, how to do better in.
Thank you, Pak. Mbak Gading, I hope that answered your question. We have another question from one of our students, Pak, from Marcela. She is asking about, okay, so the first question is, how does digitalization change the competitiveness of individual economies? And the second question is, how does sociology, anthropology, and social sciences grasp these movements based essentially on a concept of human being and a society that escapes the traditional way to frame them? And there's another question. The third question is, how
Sorry,
does
can you repeat the second question again?
How does sociology, anthropology, and social sciences grasp these movements based essentially on a concept of human being and of a society that escape a traditional way to frame them? And the third question is, how does ethnography of both the inhuman and the digital lead to exciting possibilities to reconfigure the nation? The notion, maybe not nation, the notion of what is human.
Yeah, look, on the first one, how do you actually get to be more competitive than the other in the digital context? Look, I believe that, whatever applies to the conventional wisdom applies to the digital wisdom. I think for you to be competitive, for you to be more competitive than the others, it's a function of timing. It's a function of luck. It's a function of just knowing one iota of information more than the next guy. Okay? It doesn't have to be you're knowing 2 tons of more information than the next guy. If you know just 1 iota more of information than the next guy, you have the chance of being more competitive than the other guy. I can speak for the ride sharing platforms in this country. Without mentioning names, these guys, I think, rode on the back of the emergence of cheap smartphones. Okay, when the cheap ZTE handphones or the cheap whatever Oppo handphones, 10 years ago it was the ZTE smartphones that were becoming pervasive in a very cheap manner. If it wasn't for that cheapness, it would have been very difficult for the business model to thrive, because for the motorcycle driver, he would need about 5 to 10 million rupees to get a handphone. But at that time, he was able to get a smartphone that could function adequately with only spending, $1 million, if not less. And with that smartphone capability, he was able to basically take orders digitally in a seamless manner. So that, I think, was a factor that drove the ride sharing platforms to be more successful than the preceding business model. And so timing, luck, having just one iota of information more than the other guy, I think would help you become more competitive, more successful than the other in the digital technological context, as it would apply to even the traditional paradigm, the non-digital traditional paradigm. The second context question with regards to how anthropology, sociology would actually affect and actually be affected by digital technological capabilities. I think you have to put this in a broader context. I've talked a lot about data democratization versus data dictatorship, and I think the risks, and I take this off Yuval Harari's book on how we run the risk of basically being so much exposed to data dictatorship. And a classic example of this is actually Facebook, okay, and Google. They extract so much information from you for the benefit of themselves as opposed to the benefit of you. Okay, as much as we think that they are the product, we use their product on our handphone, it's actually much more the other way around. We are actually the product. We're actually one data point that they keep scraping or extracting on a continuous basis so that they could actually simulate a predictive economic model in terms of what they can sell to you next, what sort of shampoo they can sell to you, what sort of TV they can sell to you, what sort of pictures they can sell you that could lead you to buying things. So it becomes a transactional episode after the extraction of the data point from your habit or lifestyle. Every time you punch in likes on your Facebook, on your Instagram, or on your Twitter, somebody on the other side of the planet basically takes a look at not only what you press, but how many times and how frequently you press that. And they can actually come up with a predictive economic model in terms of what sort of products that you're likely to buy next, and how frequently you're going to be buying those products, and what services you're likely to buy next, and how frequently you're going to be buying those services. And they could actually even hypnotize you to basically listen to a set of shows on YouTube that you've never seen, but just by way of that predictive economic model, they can show you certain things that you are more than likely to like. And that at the end of the day basically leads to a transactional type of episode where the transaction only benefits those two guys, Google and Facebook, because they get advertising revenues from the advertisers who believe in their predictive economic modeling, just by way of the collection and accumulation of data points from yourself and the other 4 or 5 billion people that would have been using their devices or their apps. So that in a way affects anthropology, that in a way affects sociology, and I think in a more negative manner than positive manner, in that it creates, I think, more of a social inequity as opposed to a social equity, because they stand to benefit a lot more than you. You basically are at their expense. You are just a data that's being extracted for the benefit of the bigger picture, so that they could basically raise billions of dollars, so that they could basically increase their market capitalization to $500 billion, to $900 billion, to $1 trillion, while you don't even go up on earning scale. You're just at the same earning level as you would have been yesterday, a week before, last year, or 3 years ago. So that's the reality of how social inequality could actually be created by way of the misusing of digital technological capabilities. And the third part, I kind of lost it. What was the gist of the third question?
Like, it's actually related to the second one, but about how
Yeah.
we, you know, redefine ourselves as human beings.
So I think how we redefine ourselves is that, you know, we stop looking at our mobile phone. I don't see looking at our mobile phones as a very healthy way of living, to be quite honest. I use my mobile phones more to basically listen to podcasts that I think are informative or useful, as opposed to, you know, monitoring how many likes I'm going to be getting on my tweet, or how many likes I'm going to be getting on anything, or I listen to music. I think if we stick to those two, we might have a chance at becoming a better society. But if we just keep on, you know, pounding, you know, our social media platforms with our own pictures while eating the foods we're going to eat, and, you know, monitoring how many likes we're going to be getting and how frequently we're going to be, you know, getting responses and all that, is that really a healthy way of living? I'm not so sure.
Yeah.
Okay, Mbak Marcella, I hope that
That's
answered it.
Yeah, that answered my question. Thank you, Pak Gita.
Thanks.
Okay, so we'll move on to the Q&A section, Pak, if it's okay.
Sure.
There are a couple of questions here, 4 questions. I'll go to Angki Banggaditya. Hi, Pak Gita. I am Angki from SSEK Legal Consultants. You note that we only allocate a small amount of our GDP to fund R&D for technology, as that's what we are capable of so far. What do you think is the best strategy to double the allocation?
Look, if we've got 700 universities in Indonesia, right? And of all the universities in Indonesia, unfortunately or fortunately, most of the students are actually studying social sciences. Okay. Very few are studying empirical sciences. Okay. And we've seen how other countries have actually developed technologically, scientifically, faster, better, bigger than we have. Okay. And that's because of their sheer focus on STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. We've seen reports on how we actually scored on mathematics vis-a-vis our neighbors of Singapore, Hong Kong, China, Japan, South Korea, Israel, and other countries that would have done much better in mathematics than we have. So I think we know where we are, and I think we should also know where we need to be and how we get to where we want to be, right? So I would basically think about a way from a policymaking standpoint, from an educational policy standpoint, in such a way that we would basically allocate a certain percentage of the educational budget for empirical science more than ever. Yes, at the diminution of social science participation, but it's not at the absence or elimination of social science. I embrace the need for social sciences, but I think we need to embrace the need for much bigger participation in empirical science. Okay, and there is a way to do it from a policymaking standpoint. If I've got a budget of 450 trillion rupees for education this year, okay, how about if we make sure that maybe half of that or 40% of that is used for STEM, right, at the higher education level? Then we could actually filter it down to the high school and the junior high school levels, right? So that there's actually more focus. And we can even provide an incentive system for the teachers, for the principals of schools, the rectors, the deans, and what, so that, you know, they actually participate in the narrative in a much more cohesive manner. There's got to be an incentive system. Look, I'm going to allocate you more budget for empirical science purposes. It doesn't mean that you're not going to get budget for social science purposes. It only means you're going to get less for social science purposes. I think that way you're going to be able to reshape empirical science in a much more robust manner. And if you allocate more budget, then it only is going to translate into more research and development being done for empirical science purposes. So will I see that number of 0.1% of the GDP being allocated for research and development going up? Yeah, but it takes, I think, clear-headedness from a policymaking standpoint, but it also takes cohesive collaboration between the policymaker and also the academicians, be it in the public sector and also in the private sector. And I do see, I think, some sort of a challenge at the regional levels, because the universities and the schools in the region, as much as they have to basically subject their thinking and their implementation to rules and regulations, promulgated and dictated by the central government, but they also have to basically comply with the aspirations of the regional leaderships. Then it all depends also on, it also depends on, to some extent, on the thinking of the regional leaders in terms of how they want to actually prioritize, empirical science over social sciences. But I think the direction has to be given by the central government in terms of allocating more money and ensuring a proper incentive system so that there is a higher empirical science allocation for in terms of time and budget. I think it's doable, and when it gets done, I don't think it's going to get done instantaneously, but over time it's going to get done. When that gets done, I think that percentage of 0.1% research and development, out of the GDP, I think it's going to go up quite tremendously. Then we're going to see, I think, higher competitiveness vis-a-vis, other countries that have been allocating more money on research and development.
Thank you, Pak. Yeah, so as all of you know, as Pak Gita also already mentioned, Korea is at 4%, yeah, Pak? Around 4%.
Yes. Israel and South Korea are at 4%.
So hopefully we can reach 4% in the near future, Pak.
Amen.
So I'm going to take another question from Gading again. She continued with another question. Which model of digitalization may provide the best practices for Indonesia to learn from? And what are the best examples, or from which country?
Look, I think we basically have to get better educated, right? I think the digital platform is a beauty. We've seen platforms, of education that have been doing very, very well in this country, be it for tutorial or non-tutorial purposes. I think those are good examples. And thanks to COVID-19, the opportunity to actually educate and to learn, through digital means has risen in a big way. I never would have thought that I would be speaking, in front of my handphone, to a number of people, giving a lecture. I would have been stuck with that notion that, I would get in a car and go to the campus and teach out there in front of, the students. But now I can actually reach out to a broader audience, and more schools are actually doing online. Schools in the US, schools in Europe, schools in Asia, schools in Australia, schools in Africa are doing online. So I think education is key. Getting as many people as possible to know what matters and what's good is a good thing, right? And as I said earlier, we cannot just know a lot about social sciences, but I think we've got to know a lot more about empirical science. And to the extent that we actually get very good at both, I think we could run a chance of becoming a much more balanced, society, a much more sophisticated society. So that would be the first and foremost. I would do more in a digital sense. The second, again, would be how do I actually take advantage of the digital capability so that the guy that has a great idea in Maluku actually has access to capital? Because I believe in universal talents, but I don't believe in universal opportunities, right? Talent is universal, but opportunities are not universal. So it's important for that talent that is so universally available in many parts of the world, in the remote areas of the sub-Saharan countries, in the remote areas of Maluku or Papua or Flores or Java. It's important for he or she who has a great idea to actually have access to capital. When you attach that great idea with capital, it's amazing what that could become. It could become the next Amazon. It could become the next Zoom. It could become the next Google. But just because that person who has a great idea does not have access to capital, he or she is not going to be able to see the actualization of the idea. And I think it's important for the digital technological capability to be directed solely for, if not predominantly for the purposes of allocating capital in a multi-directional manner so that everybody who has great ideas has access to capital.
Thank you, Pak. We have a questioner from UGM, Pak. Her name is Karenina Lasrindi. Go ahead if you want to ask to Pak Gita directly.
Hi, Pak Gita. Thank you so much
Hello.
for your lecture. I was just wondering that I'm looking at the current telco market in Indonesia and how it's relatively monopolized. And how does that affect with the current purchasing power of some population in Indonesia regarding internet access? Because we've been talking about how higher internet speed can basically also increase economic benefits from digital technology. But looking at the current monopoly, do you think that it can affect the effort of increasing internet access? Thank you, Pak.
Okay. Look, unfortunately, the telco sector is a sector that is thick and relevant with huge capital expenditures, right? And that has been the nature of the beast ever since day one. As a result of which, the guys or the companies that would have been able to survive were those that actually had bigger capital muscles, right? At the expense of those that didn't have as big capital muscles. As a result of which, we would have basically seen a natural consolidation of the sector. You can call it duopoly, tripoly, or triopoly, or oligopoly. That's the nature of the beast. I think we would have seen a much more we would have seen a much less monopolistic nature of the landscape if the game would not have been too heavy and thick on capital expenditure. Now, going forward, if we were to basically see more broadband access capability for the broader, population, put this in the context of 5G, okay? There's been some studies that basically say that if you want to move from 4G to 5G for the purposes of better quality, faster data transmission, it's mainly data, not voice, better and faster data transmission, we're talking about basically multiplying the number of base stations in a magnitude of hundreds. Meaning, if within a certain radius of an urban setting, you had one base station for 4G capability, but if you want to move to the next level of 5G, you may need to install between 100 to 300 additional base stations so that you can actually get that necessary, better, and faster data transmission capability. Installing one base station is expensive, as it is, much less installing 300 base stations. So, and if you're a telco company that supposedly has great capital muscles, but if you need to spend 300 times more, you're constrained. Okay, so as much as you want the telco companies to basically set the tariff to be much more accessible for the greater number of people in the population, they run a business where they've got to make a return for themselves and their shareholders. So I think it becomes dilemmatic, as much as you want to basically provide better and more access to the people, better as in 5G, more as in, more installation of fiber optics or broadband capabilities. So would the government come in to help some of these companies? I'm not so sure. The government, I think, would be more willing to serve as a regulator of pricing, but I don't think they would come in to the extent of capital infusion for, rolling out, more and better broadband capabilities for the people. Some countries, the governments actually chip in. In China, they come in and they put in a lot of money. Not to mention that, the largest telco company out there is actually a state-owned entity. So, they're vested in basically making sure that there's more accessibility of data by the people. Are we there yet? No, because of the fiscal space limitations of the government of Indonesia. At the moment, I think the government is much more focused on making sure that, we provide this, the social safety net for those that would have been affected by COVID-19. Plus the healthcare capabilities that's needed by the people that would have been affected by COVID-19. So it's still a long way, I think, before we can see a much bigger, penetration of better broadband, capability for the people of Indonesia.
Okay, thank you, Pak Gita.
Thank you, Pak. So I'm going to take a question from you too, Pak.
Okay.
Pak Gita, I am Bintang. His name is Karisma Bintang. I am Bintang, currently supporting GOAL in regulatory reform on business license. At the moment, the use of Digitech in global context is growing rapidly. Our government is also heading in that way. We can refer to some government projects on Digitech, such as electronic filing on tax, OSS, INSW, and a bunch of other systems, which we believe these systems should be improving government services, creating efficiency, and generating economic impact. From your perspective, is now the right time for our government to establish some kind of national government digital service agency to manage the effectiveness of all these government systems? Thank you.
Look, you guys had a lecture on tax e-filing, right? Charles, being the founder of Online Pajak, he's been, I think, instrumental in getting more and more people, including the regulator, to be aware of, the simplicity and ease with which people file tax electronically. And he's been able to basically garner so many more people to file taxes electronically. This is good in the sense that this would translate into, with greater simplicity, greater ease with which people file taxes. It only means that the government is going to have an easier time collecting taxes. Now, when the government has an easier time collecting taxes, I don't mean now, but going forward, if they have an easier time collecting taxes, they run a chance of basically being able to collect more taxes. The more tax revenues they get, then the more they can spend on building bridges, educating the public, and providing social safety nets and what have you. So I think the digitization of any economic activity that connects the people with the government is good, as long as it means a greater fiscal space for the government, so that the government could actually be spending more for the benefit of the people. Now, if the question relates to whether or not we need to have a particular agency that's empowered for the purpose of enabling the tech sector to move faster, better, more efficiently, more effectively, I'm all for it. Okay, but is that because we don't have a particular agency that's supposed to be handling that yet, or is it because we already have a pre-existing agency that's supposed to be handling it, but it's not handling it in the kind of way that we would have hoped they should? So I think those two are the issues that we need to be, having a conversation on. I don't see the benefit of basically creating one institution in substitution of another that would have existed, that should have been designed for doing exactly what this new institution that's going to be set up is supposed to do. We're supposedly, we're supposed to have the Ministry of Infocom that's supposed to be handling this. Maybe this could be an agency underneath the Ministry of Infocom for purposes of enabling digital transformation in a much more efficient and effective manner. Or should it be at a cabinet level, at a ministerial level? I'm not so sure. I think this could be handled within an agency that's supposed to be relevant to the pre-existing portfolio that was supposed to handle this, and that I think naturally fits into the Ministry of Infocom. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's sort of like how I would think about this.
Thank you, Pak. Another question from YouTube, Pak. This is from one of our students, former students, about artificial intelligence. This could be seen as the new Cold War between the US and China. How should Indonesia navigate to continually exercise free and active foreign policy despite growing information asymmetry?
Look, there is already a growing information asymmetry between the private enterprise and the civil society or the individuals, okay? There is already a growing information asymmetry between nations, okay? We don't know as much about the cause of COVID-19 as perhaps the Chinese would. And I think we need to know, a lot more about how this thing would have originated, whether it originated in China or it originated elsewhere, so that we can actually do something to prevent this from happening again. So you can build the argument of growing asymmetry of information at different levels, right? And how do you actually put this in the context of how artificial intelligence could help reduce the asymmetry? I think it's going to be tough. I think there's going to be a race to the end in artificial intelligence between the two countries, i.e. China and the US. China, I think, seems to be very, very ambitious in ramping up its spending on each phase of the artificial intelligence, business, internet, perception, and autonomous. The United States, I think, is equally ambitious. At the end of the day, it depends on who's got more money to spend. right? And these two are actually the two largest economies of the world, one at 22 trillion, the other one at 13 trillion. And one seems to have been growing at a faster rate than the other. But with COVID-19, I think both economies are likely to decelerate in terms of their economic growth rate. So there is an inherent limitation in terms of how fast they could grow their economic space so that they could actually race to the end in terms of the artificial intelligence. So what does Indonesia have to do in the context of all this? As I've said earlier, I think, you know, whoever, irrespective of who wins the race, we've got to know what it takes, you know, to actually be knowledgeable about artificial intelligence. And that would only mean that we're going to have to allocate a lot more of our spending budget for education into, you know, empirical science, as opposed to only social science. And I think the reason why people have been choosing social sciences more than empirical science is not because that the government has been encouraging more social sciences as opposed to empirical sciences. I don't think the government has been discriminatory about either of the two. But I think it is a natural instinct for people to actually choose social sciences because it may seem easier than empirical sciences, right? Some people, you know, think mathematics is boring. Some people think physics is boring. Some people think computer science is difficult. But I think if the government were to come out with some sort of a mandate that, you know, okay, guys, you know, out of 100 people, 30 will study empirical science, 70 will study social sciences, then I think we're going to be able to mold it in a way that, you know, in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to have a much better understanding of artificial intelligence. And I think not only are we going to be able to have a much better understanding of artificial intelligence, what we're going to have a much greater ability and capacity to size up as to which of these two countries that we should be leaning towards. And there is no reason for us not to be leaning to both of them, as long as, you know, learning from the both, you know, from both countries would actually be net beneficial for us. So from a geopolitical standpoint, I don't think the complication will arise out of the perspective of how artificial intelligence is going to affect, you know, China vis-a-vis the United States. I think the geopolitical complication is going to arise from other perspectives.
Thank you, Pak Gita. So there are quite a lot of questions here in the Q&A section, and we might not be able to get through all of them once again. And we only have until 3:30, Pak. So I'll just go ahead to the next questioner.
I might run a battery on my handphone. So
okay, Pak.
And I don't know how to charge my handphone while I'm listening through my headset, but you know, we'll deal with it when it runs out. Yeah.
Thank you. So the next questioner is from Melza. Melza, do you want to directly ask Pak Gita?
Okay. Hello, Pak Gita. My name is Melza. I'm a student from Institut Teknologi Bandung. I'd like to thank you for these past weeks. You gave us many great insights from this webinar series. And my question is, what is your personal opinion about the tendency of people who like to expose everything on web just because they don't understand the risk, especially for younger generation who have their first time in using digital platform? Should government conduct a policy about the digital manners to mitigate the risk for the users themselves, or educating the risks and also the benefits of using the digital platform from elementary school level? Thank you, Pak Gita.
Well, first of all, I don't believe education to be done only at schools. I believe education, you know, is done at many levels. Okay, it starts from the home, and it extends to schools, to communities, and to how basically policy implementation is being done by the government upon those, stakeholders, inclusive of the community, your professional career, your school, your home, and all that. It's tough to basically ensure that people not expose, as many things as they have been exposing, on their, social media platforms. It's tough as it is, to tell, your kids not to post certain things on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or what. Do we want to go to the extent of actually getting the government to step in and censor stuff like that? I'm not so sure. We have decided, we've made a decision to move on as a democracy. We're not, a communist country. We're not a socialist country like, China. China, I think, has shown, that they could basically control the behaviors of their people. They even would go to the extent of surveilling, activities on the internet by their population or by their people, so that they can actually not only monitor their, financial credit status, but they could also measure their social credit status. And all these attributes actually go into the mix of measuring how they actually thrive as a society. Do we want to go to that extent? I don't think so. I'm in the other school of thought where I think we've decided to be a democracy, and I think democracy has to be respected in ways that anybody has the right to express his or her own views and feelings and whatever. But I do sense a window of opportunity by all of us, and particularly those that are in the academic domain and those in the policy making domain, to basically come up with certain disciplines of teaching that would basically help reshape how we're supposed to be expressing our views and opinions. And hopefully that would translate into our ability to, not post everything on the social media platforms. But as far as controlling that to the fullest extent possible, I'm not so sure. As far as the governments being able to step in and censor that sort of a behavior, I'm not so sure if we want to go to that extent. I'm actually worried about that, but I'm less worried about that than my worry about how actually private companies are actually extracting data from you and monetizing upon it for themselves without you being able to benefit from it. So that I think is a bigger concern for us to be thinking about going forward.
Thank you, Pagita. Melza, I hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank you very much, Pagita.
Okay, so we have a
Thanks.
questioner from our panelist here, one of our panelists, Era Pratama. Go ahead, Mas.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me clearly, Pak Gita?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I can.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Pratama. Last year, we heard that the president planned to change the several part of public sector, i.e. the civil servant, to the artificial intelligence. What is your opinion about that? Because in my opinion, for instance, decision-making process cannot be given to artificial intelligence because it needs judgment. What do you think about this? Thank you.
Look, I actually had a debate about this in 2014 at the World Economic Forum with, Larry Summers, and it was being moderated by Tom Friedman, the columnist from New York Times. As much as I believe in robotization of, labor, be it in the civil servants, domain or outside the civil servants domain, I think the question is more with respect to where you are in terms of the GDP per capita, right? This is a bit of a long explanation. I think it's easier to think about using artificial intelligence and robotics to enhance, to augment, or even replace manual labor when you are at a $50,000 to $60,000 GDP per capita country, as opposed to when you're still at a $4,000 GDP per capita country. You run a much bigger risk of getting into, a political issue, a social issue, when you're at a much lower GDP per capita level, like $4,000. Whereas if you're at a $60,000 GDP per capita level, you can assume that everybody around you is rational. You can assume that everybody around you is sophisticated, and you can assume that everybody around you has enough has enough to eat and drink on a daily basis. But when you're still at $4,000 GDP per capita, you know that there's still a lot of people around you that are poor, that can't afford food and drinks on a daily basis. So anytime you replace a manual labor with a robot or an artificial intelligence, you run into a social risk, you run into a cultural risk, you run into a political risk, you run into all kinds of risks where, when you run into any of, if not those risks, it's so tough to get out, right? And we've gone through stuff like this in 1965 and 1998. And do we want to go through that sort of an episode? Now, if it's strictly in the context of augmentation, right, of the pre-existing civil servants with respect to, using artificial intelligence so that you can actually, garner higher proficiency and efficiency, I'm okay with that. But I'm okay with it as long as the civil servants actually get to learn, get to be smarter, get to actually do things, in an optimal manner. But if it gets to the point where the artificial intelligence actually gets to do just about everything that he or she was supposed to be doing, i.e. the civil servant was doing previously, then it becomes a redundant exercise, right? Then it becomes, whenever you have a redundant exercise or activity, you run into a social or a socially risky setting. And that sort of a social risk, I think, exposes you to something that could be unhealthy for the sustenance of the society and the country and the nation. So I'm not so sure if we're there yet. But I can see the benefit of using artificial intelligence for maybe more efficient tax filing, right? Maybe for, thwarting or preventing crime, right? Maybe in terms of connecting, the database of the immigration system with the tax office, so that, if anybody that hasn't paid taxes, he or she cannot leave the country, when he or she checks at the immigration desks at the airport or at the port. That sort of an artificial intelligence augmentation, I think, would be good for purposes of enhancing or embellishing civil service. But in terms of replacing it, I think there's some risk.
Okay, thank you very much, Pak.
Thank
Okay.
you, Pratama, Pak Gita. Perhaps we have time for one more question, Pak, before we
Sure.
close it. So I'd like to invite Gertrude Nicholas to ask. Go ahead, Gertrude.
Hi, Pagita. This is Gertrude. I'm with Swift Commerce. It's actually 3 a.m. for me right now. But
Oh, no kidding. Where are you?
so my question is regarding with the digital supply chain part. Um, as you know, like how the psychology of the powerlessness that China has created because of COVID-19, to where everybody's heavily dependent on them. So with that, there's also a lot of these pockets of startups that are wanting to go into the AI and robotics part, like just niches of it, not like the whole supply chain. So do you think would that be like a positive direction to go into? And also, do you think that this is like a big game changer for Amazon to actually penetrate into Asia?
Sorry, what would be a good thing to consider? Could you repeat that part again?
To consider like for a lot of like pockets of like startups to actually go into the digital supply chain niches.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I've made a comment about this a week or two ago in that because of the global overdependence on the manufacturing capability of China, the world over, many countries around the world, including those in the U.S. and Europe and here in Asia, have been exposed to this vulnerability, right? Many countries around the world are not getting enough masks, on a timely basis, not getting ventilators on a timely basis, getting medicine, on a timely basis. I'm pretty, sure that there's conversations around the world amongst policymakers and also legislators as to remold the policy posture so that there's a more distributed method of supplying or getting or sourcing things, as opposed to just being able to concentrate on or rely on one concentrated, source of goods and services. So you're already hearing, postures from countries like Japan as to relocate, manufacturing capabilities from China either back to Japan or onto other countries such as Vietnam, Mexico, and a couple of other countries. I wish Indonesia were to get mentioned in that list. And I think Indonesia will be considered as a relocation for some of these manufacturing capabilities. Now, if you build the thesis or the question in this context, then I think it makes sense for not only companies like Amazon, but startups to basically play a role in this newly formatted supply chain. Will it mean that it's going to get more costly? I think in the near foreseeable future, it may be more costly. Why? Because other countries may not have the kind of marginal productivity that China has been able to show to the world, right? They've been able to basically show to the world that they could produce anything in a most efficient and effective manner. If that were to get relocated or dislocated to other countries, it may run the risk of basically producing the same thing, be it goods or services, in a less cheap manner, in a less efficient manner, in a less effective manner. So that would have to be, I think, accounted for in the business model amongst the newly, started startups. And I think the likes of Amazon, I think, would have to take that into consideration also. Not to mention that the transportation cost and the shipping cost would also, or could be, slightly more expensive than transporting goods, from China to, the other countries. I can give you an example. It's cheaper to actually transport, an orange from China to Jakarta than it is to transport an orange from Kalimantan to Jakarta. So because of the logistical limitations intra-country, as opposed to the logistical, connectivity inter-country, right? The connectivity between China and Indonesia is actually much more efficient than the connectivity within Indonesia, or between islands or among islands in Indonesia. So I think those are some of the attributes that we have to, think about. But I think it's quite inevitable that there's going to be a redistribution of the global supply chain, by way of which I think new startups and the big Goliaths like Amazon and Alibaba would have to account for this possibility, even if it would mean more costly nature of transporting and transacting.
Okay, thank you, Pak Gita. Gertrude, I hope that answered your question. So, Pak Gita, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for staying up late.
Okay, so Pak, we actually have 2 more questions. Would it be okay to quickly address them?
Sure.
Okay, so the first question is from Muhammad Khadafi. He's asking about, well, we only have a few patents. I mean, Indonesia only have a few patent applications in comparison with scientific journals. What do you think the government needs to do to increase the patent applications of Indonesian researchers? And the second question from Monef Studio is actually related to previous questions about digital literacy and democracy. He's asking about, will digital revolution accelerate people's literacy? So those are the 2 questions, Pak.
Look, I'm not so sure if literacy is the way to define the advancement of a country. I think being able to read does not necessarily entail an advantage over those that cannot read. I think you have to be level-headed about this. If you know that you have the ability to read, you actually have to use that to actually read the right stuff, right? Unfortunately, what we're seeing is that with the prevalence of digital technology and digital platforms, people are using their literary abilities to just read a bunch of garbage on the media platforms or on the digital media platforms, right? I think if that literary ability were to be used for purposes of reading Kindle or books, then I think it would be tremendously beneficial for the society. I don't think we're at that point yet. I think we're still at a point where, as much as we are literate, we're still using our literary ability to read, I think, more disinformation, if not misinformation, in the digital platforms. And that has been, I think, the predominant cause for the information asymmetry that we have been experiencing. So that problem is only going to go away if we actually make it to read the right stuff, digitally, and we're not there yet. I forgot the first part of the question. What was the first question?
The first question was about patents, but
Yeah, okay.
application.
The number of patents coming out of Indonesia is still only in the hundreds, okay? But if you go to, like Foxconn, the Taiwanese company that's been building the iPhones and many other, digital devices, they've got, 20 factories in China? I visited their office in Taipei, their headquarter office. I was introduced to a scientist who himself held 600 patents under his name. That's just one scientist in the office, compared to Indonesia's having obtained only a few hundred patents. I think Indonesia files, a few hundreds on a yearly basis, whereas, other countries like China, the US, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, they file in the thousands on a yearly basis. It could only be remedied by way of our allocating more money and time and effort onto empirical science. And unless, somebody doesn't agree with the notion that, as for us to be better, we have to actually be more digitally wise, more digitally knowledgeable, then, there's no point in making the case for basically allocating more money and time and effort for empirical science purposes. But if we have an agreement that in order for us to be a better nation, we've got to be more digitally, informed and knowledgeable and wise, then we've got to make a bold decision about allocating more money, more time, and more effort on empirical science. And if we did that, it's only a matter of time before we could actually, produce thousands of patents on a yearly basis. And that to me is rather unfortunate that Indonesia is not yet there in terms of getting patents, at the level that, we're seeing China, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and the United States and Israel are. But does it mean that we cannot get there? No, we can get there. And we've got the money and we're showing it already. We've only been allocating, 20% of the government budget for educational purposes only a few years. People make mistakes at the beginning, and I think we stand ready to, remedy our mistakes. And once we did that, oh boy, I think the future is going to be great. So I take the long view. I take the 5-year view until 2045. Where if we know we're going to be cumulatively spending $3 to $5 trillion on education, there's no way we're not going to be able to get smart. There's no way we're not going to be able to basically, occupy the campuses of all the great universities around the world.
Thank you, Pak. So we have every reason to be optimistic then for the future.
Yes.
Okay, so I guess that concludes our session today, Pak. Thank you very much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you here.
It's always a pleasure to be here.